I'll just do a quick 2-minute intro for the people who are first time with us. So this is actually a second part of the 5-year anniversary of the user group. Last time, unfortunately, we ran out of time. And now Mike has a whole slot for himself. And he expanded his talk to include Krish as well, because we are lucky Mike is not just an architect, he's also startups mentor, so he can practically demonstrate the theory he's going to be sharing with Krish. So before, for those who came here just for this talk, like I hope you're going to come back again, because we secured 2 more presenters for April and for March. So in April, we're going to have Leah from Google talking about the Flutter. That framework is kind of gaining popularity through the roof. So we're going to learn more about it. And then if you remember the last meetup, Jacob did a teaser, like he has to run. After 20 minutes, he disappeared and there were people asking for more. So he's going to have a meetup on his own to dive into this book, Agile Data Warehousing, and cover dimensional modeling via Beam. And for those who don't know what it is, just watch the first part from the last meetup. And another bribe for you to stay until the end, we're going to do a raffle with money publications for any of their products. So go to the bit.ly shorten Serverless Toronto, SLSTO, and do the form to help us get better. And that's it. Thank you. Back to our feature presenters. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Krish. And please take it away. I'm stopping sharing.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. All right. This is the moment of truth yet again after what we had last time. So first of all, yeah, thank you everyone for joining. And to expand on Daniel's comment a little bit, this is a topic that I find sort of personally interesting. It's something that has come up with a lot of customers that I work with. And when I was thinking about the topic, Krish immediately came to mind, and some part of the journey that they went on, and he'll talk about the work that they were doing and what it was all about. But I think it'll be super helpful to hear from someone that is actually, in the weeds and implementing this stuff. So we'll start with the sort of theory side of it, and then we'll get into like the much more interesting part of it, which is real world application of it. So anyway, 5-year anniversary of the serverless group. We're kind of like 10 years, I guess, into serverless, if you want to think about it that way, right? Lambda came out in 2014. We could quibble about the exact sort of demarcation point of when this all started, but that's a pretty good proxy for it. And now that word just means so much, right? I mean, we've got serverless applied to container orchestration, to NoSQL data persistence, to even to data warehousing, relational databases, things like that, OpenSearch. So with all these different aspects of serverless out there, the pattern I'm going to focus on today, or the set of patterns I'm going to focus on today, is really a combination of serverless sort of managed services and event-driven architectures. And we'll talk about like that integration style, what defines it, what an event-driven architecture is, and then what workloads it actually benefits. So I'll preface this by saying I'm not here to sell you event-driven architecture. This is not a presentation where I learned about something and I think it's cool, now everyone has to use it. This is hopefully an opportunity for you to sort of put another arrow in your quiver, or find another avenue of exploration for appropriate workloads, or when you think it might be interesting to you. So this is our agenda for today, at least on my side. So we'll talk a little bit about why this matters, what event-driven architectures are, some of those integration patterns. You've probably seen a couple of them, but we'll hopefully, when you put them all in context with each other, it becomes a bigger, more cohesive picture for you. And then we'll talk a little bit more about where this goes, like what's the big picture of all this. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet before, nice to meet you. This is me. I think everything you need to know about me is on this slide. I, in my day job, work in the startup team in AWS. I'm a manager for the engaged startup territory there, but I spent about 6 years as a solutions architect, as an individual contributor, working directly with customers like Krish, as they were going through programs like Techstars. So seed stage and Series A stage startups that are doing cool things. So kind of a great place to work, and everything else you could want to know about me is on here. Feel free to connect on social. Always interested in either being helpful. So if there's any way that I can be of assistance to you as someone on the inside of AWS, or just in general in the community, don't hesitate to reach out. And then for the S posting side of things, if you want to connect on Twitter while it's still around, that'd be great too. So let's get started. I am quite confident you have seen this slide before, probably several thousand times, but just using it as a bit of a reminder of what brought us here, right? So we had this evolution of monolithic applications that eventually transitioned into a sort of more service-based approach. We had the introduction of virtualization and virtual machines. Those services turned into microservices. We arrived in the container orchestrated world and eventually serverless. And so as I mentioned before, that term serverless now covers compute, covers data persistence, covers storage. So it opens up a lot of sort of interesting patterns that we can leverage. One of the things that I've noticed with our customers is that teams that are sort of pursuing this microservice architecture can find out that as things get a little bit more complicated, the integration patterns can ultimately sort of still end up producing a very monolithic-esque, tightly coupled and sometimes fragile workload. So despite the attempt to move towards this pattern that is supposed to bring all these benefits, that they still find they're getting the same outcomes. So there's some integration patterns you can look at to help mitigate those challenges and some that introduce some of those challenges. It's not just internal service to service communication either. I mentioned most of my customers are startups. We encourage them strongly, and they typically do at the beginning phases of the business, look to glue together as many pre-existing services as they can. Right? We don't want them necessarily building things from scratch and trying to optimize things that they don't need to be optimizing in the early stages. So you have this explosion of service integration just by default. Never mind how complex your core workload is. You're going to be tying in all kinds of other things as well, and that can absolutely get you into this position of complexity through integration patterns. So I said coupling, right? I use that phrase, so let's just touch on that for a minute. What is coupling? Well, the technical definition is at the top of this slide. Coupling is a measure of independent variability between connected systems. That's certainly a mouthful. What does that actually mean? Simplistically, it means that if system B can change its behavior without affecting system A, or change its implementation without affecting system A, then they are more loosely coupled than tightly coupled, right? So you can modify B, you can even replace it completely, potentially without impacting A at all. A doesn't need to know anything about it, and you're moving towards what we call loosely coupled at that point. It's important to also sort of highlight that coupling is not binary. Something is not either coupled or decoupled. They're two ends of a scale, and it's going to sit somewhere in between. Not only is it a scale in one dimension, but it's a scale in multiple dimensions. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that applications or multiple applications, multiple services can potentially be coupled. So it's good to think about like what some of those are as you're designing your systems and what the impact of that is going to be. I'll give you a couple examples of that, like technology, particularly like so the ease of integration. Obviously, in a monolithic application, it's all the same language. In a distributed environment, you may have multiple languages. What sort of challenges could that potentially introduce? Maybe around data types, things like that. Location dependency really is like the one people think of most, right? So it's like, well, there's this thing at this IP address or this thing at this domain name, and I need to talk to it, right? So how easy is it to change that? How tightly connected are two services based on where they actually reside and how they communicate with each other, right? So it's the format of communication. So all these things, right? Temporal dependencies. So is it synchronous? Is it asynchronous? So these are all things to think about. Not just is this all running in a monolithic application, but even if they're distributed into different microservices, have we introduced coupling potentially through some of these things as well? And again, this is not a value judgment. Like potentially loose coupling versus tighter coupling is going to be workload appropriate, right? So you want to think about like whether it's going to be something that's impactful for that workload or not. So let's take a look at what I mean by, or what we mean when we say event-driven architecture. What is it? Like, what are the components of it? What are the key concepts of it? These are the key tools and concepts to think about when you're assessing sort of, is something an event-driven architecture? Could something be an event-driven architecture versus a more traditional one? The first thing on the left here is the event router. This is something that is going to help abstract the different components in the system, right? So we can call it a producer and a consumer, but ultimately it's just different services. So it's going to be something that sits in between the services. You can publish to that router and consume from it without any necessarily detailed knowledge of the service on the other side. Think about all those different areas of coupling that you can sort of ignore, hopefully, with something like this in between. So just to put it in context for you, if you're familiar with the AWS platform, event routers would be things like EventBridge or even Amazon SNS. So those are a key component. Secondly, and this is more of like a behavioral thing, events typically are asynchronous. Right, so you don't necessarily need to move on to, you don't need to wait for a response before you move on to the next step. You can see in the middle of the slide here that we have a client calling service A is calling service B, but we're not waiting for a response from service B. So we're returning to the client because, you know, obviously in this case, we don't need the response data from service B, right? So there's no dependency on that response content. So you can think about any sort of asynchronous process as a great candidate for an event-driven architecture. And you can oftentimes, I've worked with a lot of customers on sort of pulling perceived latency or pulling latency out of their applications just by saying, well, you know, do you need the downstream call to finish before you return a response to the customer, right, or to the client? So something to think about. There's also, you know, sort of opportunities for improvements in resilience through this, but that also brings us to sort of the third thing on the slide here. Another tool in the arsenal with event-driven architectures is the event store. I think this is the one a lot of people think of first when they think about it, right? So this is something that's going to allow you to decouple things like processing speed. So if you have high variability potentially in like inbound, and you're going to turn those into events, or you just have a very constrained like processing capability from a downstream service, you can use an event store to buffer that in between. And so if you're familiar again with AWS services, now we're talking about like SQS as sort of the primary one that most people are familiar with. It's a queue, but there are other options, right? MQ is another one using more standard APIs and protocols. There are a variety of different options out there. So these are the core tools, essentially, and they come in various flavors and forms, right? But these are the core tools on the left and right, and the core pattern that you want to think about for event-driven architectures. So we'll talk a little bit about what an event is, how you should think about that as well. An event in the simplest terms is like a signal that a system's state has changed in some way, right? So it means essentially that like something has happened, which is literally the definition of an event. They tell us something, right? So state has changed. They're telling us something specific about that state change. They generally have semantic intent, right? So events have names, things like order created, that give you a indication of what has changed and then the details of it. And you should think about events as an immutable series of data points, right? So you could have multiple events in sequence that represent multiple changes to the same underlying system and its state, possibly to a record, right? But you're going to process those, you know, possibly in order, right? That may matter, it may not, but they're immutable, right? Like when you get an event, that thing has already happened. You're not participating in that process per se, right? Like you're just responding and reacting to it. So they're pretty lightweight. They generally include, you know, anything that would be common across business domains, and then typically IDs for anything that you need more detail from that you could go to a source of truth to get. So you'll see on the right sort of like a sample stream of events, right? So you have a timestamp, and you have what happened, what changed, what state changed in the system. A customer was created, an order was created, a payment was successful, the customer was updated. So the difference between event-driven architectures and maybe what you're a little bit more familiar with, right? In the past, we're sort of more in a command-oriented environment versus an event-oriented environment. So when you have tightly coupled systems that are synchronous and waiting on responses from each other, what you're really doing is sort of like communicating current status between services, right? And it's command oriented, as in like one service is going to reach out and say, create an account for me, and the other service is going to do that, and then they're going to respond back with the successful details or failure information of that account creation. Whereas in the event-driven architecture, an account gets created and you just publish an event that says account created, and services that care about that will respond to it accordingly. The sort of key distinctions here, right? Like a command-oriented architecture has intent. It's asking someone to do something directly. It generally knows about the target, about the downstream. So the sort of first service in line needs to know about the services that are downstream from it and need to be told what to do. Whereas on the event side, it's just a fact that gets emitted, right? One or more downstream parties can observe it, and then they can respond to it if it's relevant to them. So producers don't need to know what the downstream services necessarily will do with that information. They just need to publish it. And those events are observable, right? It's one of the keywords that we end up using all the time here. Command-based in integration patterns still have use cases, but in any sort of asynchronous environment, when you're trying to move towards an event-driven architecture, you want a preference to those observable events when you can. This is an example of what a very, very simple event might look like. So again, it's a signal that a state has changed. And if we look at it, we see that semantic intent here, order created, right? It tells us what type of event it is. That's probably the primary thing you would filter on for downstream services. So there's maybe services that care about the order created event, so they would be looking for that and filtering on it. Again, they don't change, right? It's just a piece of information that you get and respond to. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but like I say, decrease coupling by restricting information. So you don't want to necessarily just like put a ton of payload information into the event. You want to try and be as lean initially as you can with what gets included. This is a kind of evolutionary process that people building event-driven architectures will go through. Again, a continuum, right? So just like coupling is not, binary. It's a scale. Same thing with sort of how complex you want your events to be, how rich you want your events to be. On the light side, we have what we call a sparse event. That literally just has the core IDs and the timestamp. And then on the right side here, we'd have the opposite of that, the other side of the scale of that, a full state description. And this is where you're just going to stuff everything you know about that event into the payload. So it's like, which one would you choose? Well, they both have pros and cons, right? So the less you publish, the less you need to change, most likely in the future, right? So you maintain, hopefully, like loose coupling across the services, but you do place a burden on those downstream services that if they need more detailed information about, say customer 456 or order 123, they're going to have to request that from the service that owns that information, right? From the source of truth. So you think about sort of one of the key patterns in microservices is ownership of the data persistence in each service. So they're going to have to go get that information. In a very mature system, you can see how this could down the line become potentially a problem, a scaling problem. You could be passing a whole bunch of very similar, very, very sparse events to dozens of downstream systems that are all then going to potentially go and ask for the same information from the source of truth. So really what we suggest people do is they start as close to the left as they can, and then observe, right? Observe the way your systems interact with each other, observe the sort of types of similar requests that get created for more detailed information, and then start to think about filling in your event payloads with that bare minimum amount of information you need to maintain that balance of flexibility, but without sort of creating thundering herd events every time you publish an event where a bunch of downstream services are going to be looking for more details about it as well. So it becomes something that evolves as your application grows and gets more complex as well. Okay, so I want to run through some of the integration patterns that we see here, and some of these are very simple and some of them are a little bit more complex, but I would say like most of these patterns are pretty simple on their own, right? It's really more the combination of these patterns into bigger workloads and bigger workflows where you start to get some of that complexity. So if you think, probably familiar with Gall's law, right? No complex system can work unless it evolves essentially from a working simple system, right? So think about these as building blocks for components of more complex event-driven workloads. So the one you're probably most familiar with, and the one we're trying to kind of get away from here, is that synchronous request response model, right? So this is what I would say is not event-driven. You're probably very familiar with this. You've been building REST applications in the past or microservice environments. It's low latency. It's pretty simple. When it fails, right? The failure mode is very easy to understand and obvious, but it comes with some challenges. If the receiver fails, you've got requests going nowhere potentially, right? Depending on how you're handling failure, retry, back off, all those types of things. As your environment matures, you may start overloading some of your downstream services as well, and just not being able to keep up with the scale. So some of those challenges are what we're trying to address here with some of the event-driven stuff. So look at the first one, asynchronous point-to-point, and this essentially means putting in a queue. And again, this is one that most people are sort of early stage familiar with. They may not even sort of realize they're building an event-driven architecture. They're just trying to decouple two services with different rates of processing, but they are. This is one of your more simplistic event-driven architectures. So it decreases temporal coupling now, right? So you don't have to necessarily have them processing the messages synchronously and at the same speed. It makes it resilient to receiver failure in the sense of if the receiver goes offline, the messages obviously are stored in a queue until the receiver comes back online and can start processing them. And it puts control of the processing speed in the hand of the receiver as well. So some good benefits there. Additionally, you can get a little bit more complicated, include something like a dead letter queue. Think about making sure you're getting like poison pill messages out of the queue. And you can also sort of rely on it, especially in a managed service environment, to have each receiver consume like a message once, basically, right? So a receiver will take a message off the queue, it'll process it, no other receiver will be working on that message in the meantime. So you can start to scale horizontally with some consistency in the way you're processing those messages. So this is a great example of a very simple event-driven architecture. There are some challenges with it, things like response correlation. So if the sender needs to know anything about the response, right? Like the receivers can also can always post back to a queue again, but then you have correlation logic between those things with a sender also consuming from a queue as well as publishing to a queue. When there is issues with backlog, right? When the receivers are offline or not processing fast enough, you may just have irrecoverable amounts of backup in that queue system. And another sort of interesting challenge is multi-tenant systems, right? So how do you maintain fairness when you have potentially one upstream service just dropping thousands of messages per second into a queue and one dropping a couple messages? So there are ways to approach that, ways to deal with that, but it's a sort of an inherent problem of a very simple queue-based system. The next pattern that you'll probably see in various places is a point-to-point model. So this is using one of the routers that I talked about before. In this case, SNS, right? So using a point-to-point router. So essentially, in this case, the sender is deciding where to send the message, right? So we've divided up our receivers. Rather than posting them directly, we're putting that message into simple notification service or something similar, and we're decoupling them that way. This does have some additional challenges, though. This is not a great pattern. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this in most use cases. It seems like you're doing, moving towards a good direction here, but the sender is still maintaining a lot of logic, right? It still has to know about the different channels. It's not really that different than knowing about the receivers. So you're gaining a little bit of like architectural resiliency with sort of managed retries and things like that in the router, right? So you don't have to maintain that logic in the sender, but you're still maintaining the location and routing logic in the sender. So it comes with some challenges, and that challenge just increases in complexity as your workload gets more complicated. So there is a place for this tool. We'll sort of look at what it is, but this is not a pattern that I would gravitate towards, but it is one that exists. Next is the bus version of the message router model. This is, so in our world, this would be Event Bridge, right? And this is a little bit more complex, but much more resilient, much more appropriate for getting around some of those challenges like reducing location coupling. So in this case, your sender on the left is publishing messages with particular details in them, right? So some of the parameters, like there is maybe a color parameter and it's either blue or purple. It's publishing it into an event bus. like EventBridge for us. And then the receivers are subscribing to the messages they care about. So we've reduced that location coupling. The sender doesn't have to know anything about the downstream logic. You can have multiple receivers processing the same message. You can have one receiver processing a particular type of message. Right? So it becomes very efficient in terms of additional logic for both senders and receivers. I will just sort of, I'll give you an overview of EventBridge just as a conceptual model. I'm not pitching EventBridge to you, but this is sort of the 30,000-foot view of what the event bus ecosystem looks like, right? And how things flow through. So if you go left to right, there's a whole bunch of different ways that events can be produced, right? So it used to be sort of AWS services would produce events through CloudWatch, and you could respond to them if you wanted to. It became apparent that that model was in high demand and much more, in a much larger variety of ways. So we introduced EventBridge as a service, as a fully managed message bus service. So not only do AWS services produce events now, your applications can produce events, right? And this is exactly like if you're building an event-driven architecture, this is what you're doing. You have custom applications that are publishing events. You can consume events also from third-party SaaS applications. So again, if you think about the startup and potentially integrating a bunch of SaaS components together with their IP, with whatever it is that makes them special, this is an opportunity to bring all those events in. Those events come into a message bus, right? Every account comes with the default one. You can create more, right? So there's a whole bunch of different reasons we could get into as to why you might want to create more than one message bus. I would again say start simple, right? Start maybe with one at the beginning and sort of see how things go. But if you have things like security concerns, if you want to limit publication of certain events to certain buses and consumption of certain events from certain buses, this becomes a pattern where you may want to start, fanning out having more than one event bus as well. And then from there, it's really about how do we get those events to the services that care about them. That is accomplished through subscriptions, which are essentially rules, right? So you create rules that filter and send those events to their targets. And again, just like there's a whole bunch of different ways you can bring events into an architecture, those events can then be consumed by a whole bunch of different downstream services. So it's not just other microservices. It can be part of your application, an API destination, could be a queue, could be something like SNS, could be a Lambda function, right? Or it could go back out to SaaS again, right? So you can route it right through the event bus and back out to another SaaS application, depending on sort of how you've composed your application in the early stages. So this is sort of just the big picture of how the EventBridge system or the event bus system here works. There's some other cool components to it: schema registry, automatic discovery, things like that. Even producing code bindings for your developers. So we'll have in IDE fully featured like IntelliSense and schema to work with and things like that. So it accelerates the developer time in a more complex environment as well. It's pretty cool. This is a concept that I just want to make sure you're thinking about as well. This drives some of the decision making and which patterns are appropriate at what time. There's two sort of key concepts in managing, the flow of events basically through a workload. The first is choreography, and choreography really is what you should think about when you're talking about coordination between different services. Sort of across domains, basically, right, across boundaries. And again, for us, I would say EventBridge or simple notification service are examples of services you use in that case. And then orchestration is a little bit different. Orchestration is something you generally would do inside of a service, right? So you're still tying together different components, but you want to apply more rigor and more deterministic approaches to how the data moves through those different components. If you need to do anything like distributed transactions or saga patterns or things like that, you're going to be looking for orchestration, right? So this is generally inside the domain, inside a single domain of a service. And in our world, you would use something like step functions. So I'll expand on that just a little bit because this is a really key point, and it's certainly a conversation that Krish and I had several times. Choreography again is between two different domains, right? So you have a service on the retail side, publishes an order created event, and then you have a fulfillment service maybe that cares about that, right? So they've created a subscription that says notify me when an event is published of the type order created. So this is much more loosely coupled between two different services that probably have different owners, different developers, different life cycles, but have a shared purpose in the bigger picture. Orchestration internally inside of a service, so inside of that retail service might look like this. The order might come in through the website. right on the left. And then they need to do a couple things in a very particular order with very particular error handling and maybe retry and possibly fanning out or parallel processing or whatnot. So you would use something like step functions to orchestrate that process internally in the service. You could certainly emit events between these different components, right? But in a case like this, it makes a little more sense to be more prescriptive, more deterministic. And then the output of that workflow, the output of that step functions workflow, and you can think about Apache Airflow as an example, right, of an open source version of that, if you're trying to sort of position that in your mind as to what that is. So step function is orchestration service, just like Airflow. And then that service would produce that order created event as the end of the orchestration process. Now that order created event becomes part of the choreography between two different services or two different domains. So of course, right, these things go together. All of the things we've talked about here end up going together. So if we look at like a much more complex application, a big picture application here, you can see all these different pieces and how they might sit together, right? So you have users on the left-hand side, they're producing things or they're interacting with an application, and what's actually another thing I want to point out here is part of the reason Krish is here is because, this is not just like SaaS applications, right? Not just websites, like user-facing applications. This is applicable to all sorts of different domains. But in this particular case, we have an API. The API is taking in a request. It's working with other APIs, either internal or external, in a tightly orchestrated process through a step functions workflow. And then it's taking the result of that right in the middle of the slide and publishing an event. There are a series of rules, right? So based on the parameters of that event, there are a bunch of downstream services on the right that may or may not care about that event that gets published, but based on the filters in those rules, they will receive that event if it's appropriate to them. And then you can see some of the other services present here again, right? So the very, very top service in this example on the right is actually leveraging that SNS router to fan out a message like a push notification to thousands of downstream consumers, right? That's a great use case for that particular type of event router. So when you're doing that big fan out, it makes a lot of sense versus when you're trying to make decisions about who should receive those events. Like if it was much more complex logic, you'd still be back towards the event bridge version of that. The second one down here again is just it's sort of a repeat, right? So the rule picks up an event, you run another coordinated orchestrated workflow, and you produce another event as the output. The third one down has the event store incorporated, so you have a Lambda function that's sort of consistently processing messages at the same rate. So you don't have, you can keep that Lambda function running at a rate that you would a concurrency that you would prefer. And then down below, we just have another maybe internal application, right? So a rule gets pushed to an API gateway that is backed by an ALB, load balanced web application. So all these different components play together. You can mix and match these pieces of the puzzle to build out a very complicated workflow, but the components themselves are quite simple in the way they operate and have very clear sort of good use cases and not great use cases. One or two other small things I want to touch on before we turn it over to Krish as well. A topic that comes up frequently is, what about if I need uniqueness in my events? I absolutely hate trying to say this word. I think I get it wrong every time, but if item potency is a requirement in your workload, what does that mean? It means if you send the exact same event twice, and there's all kinds of reasons that could happen. We're dealing with distributed systems, things happen. So let's say the same event accidentally gets published twice. It means that the response you get back from the downstream service is the same, right? So if you accidentally fire an order creation twice, you don't actually create two orders. The second call just returns the same information from the first order, basically. So it's a very simplistic definition of it, but this can be an important component of systems. So there's a couple things to think about here if this is important to you. One is to potentially just generate a key, right? Item potency key, which is generally the first few digits of a hash of the either the entire event payload or specific fields in the event payload, right? You obviously need to use the same fields every time you create the hash, but that's one way to sort of double check whether you've seen that message before. There's a couple other ways to do this, right? So you're obviously going to be leaning on an external data store if you're doing that hash check. You want to think about maybe time appropriateness, like how long of a period of time do we care about duplicate events, and maybe an event that comes in hours later or days later is not actually a duplicate. But these are just sort of, these are insights that you would have based on your particular workload, and you'd have to think about it. There's a couple of resources on here to help you with this. There is a Lambda Power Tools library for Python, at least at this point, that will manage this idempotency for you. So you just incorporate the library into your Python Lambda functions, parameterize it the way you want, and it'll deal with all of these things for you. And then there's some articles there's one article in particular in what's called the Builders Library. This is a sort of medium form content written by principal engineers or senior principal engineers on our side that talks about high level concepts. Very rarely even gets into like specific AWS services, right? It's very theoretical. And there's a great article over there about building idempotent APIs. And how to sort of reason about that and architect for that. So if that's something that's important to you, I would absolutely check that out. Even if it's not important to you, it's good, like super nerdy reading. So I encourage you to take a look at it. So takeaways from this, what do I want you to remember from what we talked about today? Your goal generally is to try and introduce decoupling, right? To get looser coupling when appropriate. And generally you want to do that, think about that as the producers and consumers of events. You can think about, decoupling with a queue. If it gets a little bit more complicated than that, and you have multiple subscribers, you want to think about that pub sub model with Event Bridge or SNS. If you need strict ordering or deduplication, you can think about incorporating third-party libraries or using a first in, first out queue. That comes with a slightly lower throughput capabilities than a regular queue, but is also another way to approach that. As you're getting into choreography between domains, right, you want to be thinking about using something like Event Bridge. And if you're orchestrating in a very like deterministic graph inside of a service, you want to think about something like a workflow engine a la AWS step functions. So these are the sort of bits and pieces that you're going to use to build those event-driven architectures and try and reap some of the benefits of them. Daniel, I'm sure, will share the deck afterwards as well. So I've got a few more links in here for you that might be helpful. There's a couple of workshops, basically, or like trainings around event-driven architectures and how to sort of build those hands-on, as well as some basic information about them too. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. Hopefully the theory is a good setup for providing some context and reasoning about the much more interesting component of this, which is what happens when the rubber hits the road and you're actually building something. So I'll turn it over to Krish at this point, or Daniel, and we'll go from there.
Krish, you go next, and we'll do Q&A at the end.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Mike. Let me start sharing my screen. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, hi everyone again. It's great to be here. It's the first time that I'm at the Serverless Toronto meetup, so and good to be here as a speaker. Hopefully, I'll be attending some more sessions in the future. So like Mike explained, I'll go into how the implementation of serverless data pipelines work for us in the real world. So first, before I start, I'll just give you a brief introduction about myself. So I'm Krish Perumal. I'm the co-founder CTO of Cedience. For the past 10 years, I've been working on artificial intelligence in general. My main focus has been on natural language processing. And I've been pretty disappointed with all the developments with ChatGPT because it feels like the last 10 years of research that I've done have all gone to waste just with large language models. But yeah, on a serious note, otherwise, I worked at several research institutes in India first, then in Germany for a year. And then I did my master's at the University of Toronto, where again, I focused on NLP. Then I worked on computer vision at a couple of startups. And then I was also a senior research engineer at Samsung's AI Center in Toronto, where I worked at the intersection of computer vision and NLP. And then, in 2020 is when I co-founded Cedience along with Amin Osmani. So I'll tell you a little bit about Cedience first. So first, Cedience is an AI startup that's on a mission to make the approval of life-saving medicines more predictable. As you might, as many of you might be aware, drug development is a costly and time-consuming process, and this happens often due to unexpected delays in the approval by agencies like the FDA, Health Canada, EMA. Now, of course, the delays are often due to valid reasons, and this is where we come in. What we do is we centralize information from all the regulatory agencies and make sense of it using NLP, computer vision, and machine learning. So basically, our platform is able to reconstruct the regulatory journeys of drug development teams. So by that, what I mean is right from when a drug is discovered to the trials taking place, the safety and efficacy data being analyzed, and the drug being manufactured on a large scale and then being commercialized. That whole process we aim to reconstruct using historical data that we mine. Then we highlight the lessons within all of this, within the journey of each drug, and this we use to help the drug development teams de-risk their future strategies. So again, to put it a little bit more, to put it a little bit more, easier for you to understand, the drug development teams can get answers to questions on regulatory approval using our web application. So the kind of questions that that you can get answers to are, say for drugs similar to mine, how long did the approval process take? What were the areas of highest concern for the FDA? Are my safety and efficacy results adequate to support approval? What do I need to do more in order to make sure that this drug gets approved? Has there been a precedent for a specific clinical trial design? And what was the FDA's feedback on it? So basically, these are the kind of questions that users ask with our platform, and this helps them to reduce the time it takes to prepare for submissions with the FDA, preempt any concerns that FDA might have, and that hopefully reduces the time for a drug to get to market. So with that, I'll go into how we started off. So I'm basically going to kind of reconstruct, with very specific to the data pipeline topic that we're talking about, what was the objective we had. So in 2020 or 2021 January, that was a year after we founded, when we did a bunch of prototypes, did a lot of different explorations. Finally, after a lot of feedback from users, the business objective that we defined was we wanted to get to the first paying client within 2 months, and we knew what a paying client would want, right? So, and that's how we defined the technical objectives, which is 1, to centralize information from all regulatory agencies and make all of this information searchable in one place. Next, allow users to filter information based on document characteristics, like the agency name, the drug name, the approval dates, and so on. Also allow users to filter information based on entities within the document, like the reviewer name, the submission date, the phase of clinical trial, etc. So these are just some of the technical objectives. Obviously, we had a few more, but these were the main ones. So having set this objective, we went about architecting the data pipeline. So bear in mind that at this time, it was just myself as the only engineer. It was just 2 people, me and my co-founder, and we wanted to prove out this concept, right? So when we started off, this was the architecture we had in mind. So on the top left, what you see is basically a web page from the FDA, and this is referring to a specific document that you can actually download. So if you were to manually go in and look for information, you would download this document and then go in and search it, or probably read through it. So this is what we this is the first part of our architecture, where we scrape web pages like these and download the PDF documents from it, which again look like this, and then we extract the plain text using OCR, something like a Tesseract engine, and then we index that into a full text search index. Now, there are additional things that happen with the extracted text. We also extract entities from it. So like in this case, the example being, extracting Dr. Adam Smith being the reviewer name, Jan 12, 2015 being the submission date, and phase 3 being like a clinical trial phase. And this, we had NLP models running on this text to get us these tags. And then there are other modules as well, which I haven't mentioned here. There's also text classification, so classifying what this document's topic is at a higher level, identifying the structure of the documents using computer vision. So basically, trying to find out what are the different sections in these documents, and what does each section talk about. So this is the general architecture that we wanted to implement. And when we set out implementing this, the first version of it was just a proof of concept monolith. So basically, modularize all of these, individual functions that I talked about. They were just individual modules, just sequentially run on a single compute instance. The scraper, a downloader, the OCR, indexer, entity extractor, and so on. And as you can imagine here, since this is the serverless group, I guess you already would know that this is not something that is not really the best practice, but just something that helped us to quickly implement everything, do end-to-end testing, and get immediate feedback from users. So before we went about optimizing anything, we just built this out very simply, and wanted to get immediate feedback from users. The problem, of course, with this approach is that there's single point of failure. The moment any of these modules fail, everything's going to fall apart, basically. And obviously, we're wasting compute resources. It's running on a single EC2 instance, and the amount of CPU and RAM, the amount of CPU and storage we're giving it is basically dictated by the module that takes up the most amount of resources. So in this case, the OCR instance, for example. But yes, this helped us to get to that first stage, and actually, within 2 months, we were able to secure that first client, having demonstrated, just the technology that it works, that you're able to search through all the documents, you're able to filter on all of these different attributes. So that's how we went about doing V1. So next we had, we set ourselves the second objective, which is to get to another paying client within 2 months. And now we had heard from, other potential clients, about what were the concerns they had. So it was nice that we had all this data searchable, but, can I, is your data up to date? So they were very particular that the data had to be up to date, every week, so that, something that happened last week, they should be able to search today and get that information. And currently, what the version 1 architecture that we had, that was taking 2 to 3 weeks in order to run, right from scratch. If I had to run it, each time it would take 2 to 3 weeks to complete. So yes, this was the objective that we had on the technical side, and then we went about implementing the V2. So V2 was just containerizing each of these modules as microservices, and deploy each of these modules separately. We also we also separated the modules for each regulatory agency source. So by this, what I mean is, we had a scraper running for FDA, we had a separate scraper running for Health Canada. So, if the scraper for FDA fails, the scraper for Health Canada still continues to run. So the only thing you have to do is fix the FDA scraper when that fails. So this again, what this helps us do is, at least localize failures, better than before. And the way this was run again is just very simply each module calling the next one just with Docker Compose, and it's still running on a single compute instance. So really very, very dumb stuff that we really were running at this point. But it's just that it got us to at least the next stage. So the advantages of this approach, of course, is that the pipeline worked independently for each regulatory agency source. And so we were able to fully update our database every week. So every week we were always able to refill the index, make sure that it was fresh. And we were able to test at the level of each module whether everything was working as expected. The disadvantage, again, still is a single point of failure, but this time within each regulatory agency source. So say the steps of scraper, downloader, OCR running for the FDA, if any one of those modules fail, the entire pipeline fails, but just for FDA. So, but that's still of course a problem. But again, with this approach, we again got to another paying client because we were able to keep our database up to date every week. And then we set ourselves the next objective, which is to get to 3 paying clients within 6 months. So this is when, and out of these 3 paying clients, one of them is actually a big pharma client. So they obviously have low tolerance for failures. They have low tolerance for mistakes. So at this point, we had to keep data up to date every day. Like I said, the version 2 was taking 1 week to get the latest information, but now we had to keep it fresh as of every day. And we had to reduce the number of pipeline failures to a maximum of 1 per week. And we wanted to resolve any pipeline failures within a day so that users don't get affected. So now this is when we actually felt the need for developing a proper serverless data pipeline. Again, also very lucky that we were part of Techstars, the Techstars accelerator, and that's where we met Mike. And Mike was really generous with his time, and really without him, this couldn't have been possible. This is where we started using a container orchestration service. So in this case, we used the Elastic Container Service, that's AWS ECS. So again, AWS step functions, which Mike was mentioning, again, similar to that, but this is not, we don't have at this point, we didn't have a very defined workflow in terms of this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, and this was subject to change. And in fact, even right now, as of now, we keep adding a lot of modules to it. So we felt that just using AWS ECS has been, good for us. And again, so that's the orchestration service. But then for running them on compute engines, we had AWS Fargate. So ECS, obviously with ECS, you can run it on EC2 instances, or you can run it with Fargate, which would be serverless compute instances. So that's what we use here. And then for the communication between microservices, that was event-driven. So like Mike was just mentioning about the orchestration versus choreography. This is a little bit choreographed in the sense that each microservice that we have was writing to the S3 storage. So say the scraper scrapes pages from the FDA, like web pages from the FDA, it would complete that and then write the output to a text file in Amazon S3. And then other microservices that have to run after the scraper, and this could be multiple, but you can imagine, say, the downloader, which has to go through that output and download the PDF files from it, that would listen to events on that, whenever that text file appears in S3. So that we had defined using event bridge rules. So that's how the communication happened between the microservices. Now here, there was no single point of failure in the sense that even if any of the individual services, if they failed, it wasn't affecting. It would still keep running for the rest of the microservices in that pipeline. Of course, there would still be that failure case that you still have to handle, but it does not affect the other. It does not affect the working of the pipeline in general. Here, of course, we were also able to offload all of the management of infrastructure to ECS, so didn't have to worry about setting compute instances and defining the CPUs, the storage, all of those. So we were able to automatically scale that using Fargate as well. So yeah, this is what we had finally as the version 3. Of course, with ongoing challenges, these are obviously the advantages, but we were able to achieve with this with this pipeline, we were able to achieve our objective of getting 3 new clients. And of course, we've been adding more clients, until now. But this is pretty much the state of our data pipeline right now. So and I don't know if I've run through it too quickly, or if anything is unclear, please feel free to stop me, or if you have any questions, or maybe we can do it at the end, whatever you prefer. But if you have anything that you wanted to clarify, I can definitely go over it. Okay, gonna assume that. Okay.
Wow. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't see that the end was, this is the last slide. So
okay.
Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. I'm sure
there's
going to be
more.
questions.
Yeah, no, I do have some more slides. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure people weren't lost. All right. Yeah. So obviously the data pipeline that we have still has a lot of challenges. I mean, we have obviously fixed a lot of these issues. So the first thing that we faced was we had a lot of silently failing microservices. So, even though we had no single point of failure, like I was mentioning, if a microservice fails, the outputs that that should be generated for that microservice, they still go missing. So if the scraper fails to scrape a particular web page, it doesn't affect the scraping of other web pages, but it certainly, we don't get the output. Maybe there's a document, an important document present on that web page that that goes missing, and we had no way of seeing whether the service failed or not. Like we weren't maintained, we didn't have any mechanism to see whether the pipeline was working properly for each of the microservices at each level. So this is where our advice comes in. So my advice, and this is what we implemented as well, is to have another microservice to inspect the pipeline health. So this should run at regular intervals. So for example, depending on your appetite for failure, you can run it once per hour or once per day, where the microservice goes in, checks for each of the for each of the specific microservices whether there were any failures, right? So maybe you're writing to a log file that you can inspect, or whatever other mechanism. You could have, of course, otherwise also unit tests on the output of each microservice. Again, making sure that the output actually has maybe a certain attribute that you're looking for always. What we did with this is whenever we detected failures, we actually trigger emails. So in our case, we trigger Slack messages. So it directly sends it out to a channel where a couple of our engineers are present. So the moment a failure happens, we're able to identify it and go in and start fixing it. The next thing was defining orchestration with the AWS console. That's not a very user-friendly way to do it. It makes documentation very difficult as well. So initially, we had one of our engineers set it up with the AWS console, but the moment we started doing that, it was hard to transfer knowledge to other engineers. Again, this was something that Mike also had suggested to us to start using infrastructure as code. With something like AWS CDK, the Cloud Development Toolkit. So we started using that, and it took us 2 to 4 weeks to properly set this up. But once we did that, the knowledge transfer has been really smooth. So for example, an incoming engineer from last year, it just took him 2 weeks to take over the full data pipeline and start working with it. And so it's almost like auto documentation for us because we use CDK. Next, setting up orchestrated serverless data pipelines, it does require some patience, at least in our case, because we're not really experts. As you can see, even I'm not, I come from the AI side. I'm not an engineering. I'm not a purely computer engineering optimization guy. So me and also the team members that we added, they weren't experts, on the data engineering side. So it did take us about 3 months in total to deploy to production, versus something that just took me 1 month with just a monolith architecture. So my advice here is, and then this I don't know, it's more of a personal advice, and others may advise you otherwise. But my personal feeling is that you should start with a monolithic pipeline as a quick proof of concept. You should get feedback immediately from users and iron out all the chinks in your in the workflow, and then next you should go serverless. But again, you should be patient with the implementation. Make sure that you are properly architecting everything, thinking of as many corner cases as possible. But once you do it, I think the rewards are worth it. One thing I definitely say is leverage the AWS support team. I think we didn't do it enough initially, but whenever we have interacted with them, they've been really helpful. And of course, mentors like Mike Apted, who helped us a lot. Without him, we wouldn't have been able to get to this stage at all. So I think look for help from AWS, and I think they'll be happy to help. And then last, my general advice is just that you should scale up based on user needs and not purely for technical sophistication. And I'm often guilty of this, trying to do things that are technically cool, which again works in general. I mean, if you're doing some hobby project, then definitely go for it. Or if you're working on in a larger company and you have a lot of time and a lot of resources in your hands to do this, definitely go for it. But at the starting stages of a project, I would say you should always go based on user needs. Make sure that you are you're identifying exactly what the user wants. So for us, like I was saying initially, the user just wanted to be able to search across all information, did not care enough about a pipeline of data being working regularly and keeping all the data up to date. So since they weren't worried about it, and it wasn't really necessary for us to get to that first paying client, we did not start doing that at that point. But of course, when the user specifically starts asking these things, then that's when we started implementing these. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from my side. And of course, happy to answer any questions that you have. And really apologies for not including enough. Apologies for including a lot of text in this. I hope you were still able to follow along.
That is amazing. And especially that you succeeded with the startup, like getting clients, 3 clients in the first 6 months. Just awesome. But I'll let folks talk about the architecture, ask questions. So now we're coming to the Q&A part of the meetup. Any questions, you can turn on the mics, participate, or post them in the chat. And then do the mining raffle survey. I'll paste the link once again. We're going to do it at the end of the meetup. And we don't need to stay until 8. We'll wrap up when there are no more questions. So, Jonathan, you start first. I'll put you in the spot.
You want me to ask a question?
Yeah,
So
data pipelines guy.
Yeah, I can't come up with something. Mike, you mentioned some of the different challenges, and one of them I think I heard you say was like fairness in a multi-tenant system. Are there any ideas you can share for that? So if let's say that you've got like I don't know, maybe there's a queue buffering something, and you've got a Lambda processing with a concurrency of 5. But if all the traffic coming through is like 90% for one tenant, then they're going to be hogging all the Lambda processing, and then you might get delays for people who just have one request. I think that's the type of thing you were referring to.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
And is there something in any of the resources in like the builders? What do you call it? The builder's guide? No, the builder's something you mentioned.
Builder's library. Yeah.
Builder's library. Yeah. Is there any ideas for addressing things like that in there, or have you got another suggestion?
There are actually, there are ideas about multi-tenant architectures in there, as well as some other, I'm sure some other content. We have a SaaS factory team here, and I'm sure they have opined on this in a variety of different ways. But I would say, the first thing I would think about in a, non super complex environment. So if you're on the road to building something out like this, and you're, early to mid stages, and you find that becomes a problem. One of the advantages, I guess, of a lot of these, pay for consumption services is that if you have 2 of them running at a 50% of your total throughput versus one of them running at 100% of your total throughput, it costs the same, right? So you can start thinking about particular patterns where, and this is no different than like a standard sort of multi-tenant like microservice environment. It's like, well, if we have a tenant that rises to the level of dominance in the multi-tenant environment, then we need to start thinking about sharding them out. So you can either do that sort of like reactively, or you could start thinking about premium services, right? So you can build sort of tiered access to more reliable processing. If you are on the free service, you go into the backed up queue with everybody else. If you are paying a little bit more money, you get access to dedicated queues that are cleared, or are scaled to clear quickly. And you can also start thinking about individual tenancy, because ultimately, like, especially when you get into the infrastructure as code world, multi-tenancy, like sharded architecture becomes really, really simple to implement, right? It's like 1 queue, 1,000 queues, like what's the difference ultimately? So as long as you have a way of orchestrating that, it is not the web console, as Krish pointed out, right? Because that is going to be no fun. Paging through like 10 queues at a time, trying to find the one. But if you're doing it, in a sort of programmatic way, you can start thinking about really like multi-tenant becomes more about like I'm managing all the tenants together versus like I've shoved them all into like some resource constrained environment together. You can much better control the allocation of resources per tenant. So I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense and is helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that gives me some ideas. So yeah, I think that's at the end of the day, you'd probably have different queues, maybe some dedicated queues, and then some sort of a traffic cop up front that knows where to put people based on their, what level of license they have or whatever. Like there's lots of different ideas there, but okay, thanks.
Mark, you were making comments.
Yeah, so we have a situation where we have one customer that's 95% of our income and our traffic. So we provision for their major points of the day, both in Lambda and in ECS, and everything else just goes to another queue that gets, our best effort. But we really want to focus on making sure that 95% is handled with virtually no latency, basically.
I'm glad to hear that it's 95% of the traffic and 95% of the income. Because if 5% of the income, then you got an issue.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
We've all had those customers.
But you need more
Luckily, they're
Mark.
not 95% of the complaints.
Yeah.
Mark, there is saying you need at least 3 legs for the stool to be stable. You need 2 more customers at least.
Oh, well, then why don't we could sign you right up there, Daniel, if you want.
That's why I was applauding Krish. 3 customers, 6 months. Guys, feel free to talk. Like, if you don't like how you sound, tell me. I'll cut out that part of the recording.
Yeah,
and nobody watches anyways.
Type your questions if you don't want to. You don't have to come on camera. You can just be a disembodied voice if you have a question.
Well, they get encouraged. You said something, no complex system can exist if it didn't evolve from simple one. Which law was that, Mike?
Gall, Gall. I probably like butchered it in my paraphrasing of it, but
Beautiful.
I can, with the power of the internet, I can give you the correct phrasing of it here. Let's see. Oh wow, this is a popular name. So basically, the correct statement is a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that works. And then the inverse of that is also true. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be made to work. You have to start over beginning with a working simple system.
I love it. You always come with the beautiful sayings.
It's essentially a proof by induction for agility to some extent and evolutionary architecture, right?
Yes.
So do it right, do it better, and as you evolve, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And Krish, like you sounded apologetic when explaining the first architecture, but you have to start somewhere. Like you have to prove it works. It's agility. So whatever way, just.
No, usually when I hang out with serverless nerds, it usually doesn't get like, oh, wait, you're doing just something like really simple. Right?
No. We are engineers. We like to engineer, and then you kind of started the business. You have to find for the return of the business investment. And
exactly.
And that's another topic, Mike. We can have you on to help startup people with startup mind to switch.
Well, I mean, I think it's important. Like, it's great that Krish is so comfortable in like being transparent about the journey too, right? Because he mentioned it at the end, like complexity for complexity's sake is, trouble in this situation. I don't know, call it what you want, resume driven development, yak shaving, et cetera, et cetera. But it's sort of a proof point that like, look, you can start simple, you can just make it work, and then you can start iterating and improving it and migrating components of it towards maybe more fit for purpose and less operatively demanding solutions. But the point being, like, don't overcomplicate at the beginning. Just do something. Hashtag ship it, and then start iterating on it. So it literally it's not super like sexy, but it works, and you can see that here. So.
Hey, Krish, I've got a question about your architecture. It's Ian Mason here, one of Mike's disembodied voices. And I'm definitely not a serverless like microservices guy or anything like that. So this is kind of a newbie question, right? So you were talking about your services failing and having to get a Slack message and go check out why they failed. And my impression of, the whole point of, Kubernetes and Docker and all these sort of things is that they're supposed to kind of stand back up again when they fail, or have enough copies of them that it doesn't matter if they fail. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what was knocking your services over, and like, was it volume, or what would cause them to fall over?
I see. Okay. Yeah. So that's a good point. So in our case, actually, we force them to fail when they actually fail, because we don't want to. So for example, it was usually a lot of these failures are happening at the scraper stage, where we're scraping web pages and they're failing due to timeouts.
Oh.
So if you keep pinging them, then our IP gets blocked. So that's the reason why we force them to fail. But yes, it was really just simply a matter of writing them to a log file and then listening to the log file, right, for those messages. So that's why I was talking about that. But otherwise, yes, you're right. For other things where, say, at the OCR stage, if it fails, that would restart. So that wouldn't be a problem for us. Again, there are still problems there where maybe there's a file input that's coming in that's in a specific way that for which the OCR just doesn't work. So it keeps failing over and over and again, right? And that's something also that we need to detect. That has happened before as well once, but it doesn't happen regularly.
Okay, interesting. So when the scrapers fail and you force them, did you come up with like an automated way for them to just fall over after a few timeouts, and then a new one will come in with a fresh IP?
Exactly. No, so no, the fresh IP part, no, we didn't do that automatically. So that we didn't do. But usually what happens is with the scraper failing, there's basically a corner case that we have forgotten to include. Like we just missed based on, basically when the scraper was written, the page was expected to be in a certain way. And when it's not finding an element that it's supposed to find, that's when it fails. So it's just simply a matter of adding that. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's important to like bucket out the different types of failure, right? So there's like infrastructure failure, and then there's like logic failure, like application failure, and then you could substrat application failure into a couple of different, like external dependency failure, like timeouts, versus like, oops, we shipped bad code. So they're all independent like failure modes. So to your point, like the infrastructure self-healing is there. It's just they don't want to abuse the downstream systems. So they're preventative and cautious in their approach in that regard.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
About scraping sites, like they don't have APIs, or you had to do that, to have contracts with them. How does that work? Because it's quite unreliable. And we did have a meetup with somebody who got a $72,000 Google bill because he had a recursion scraper. So he kept kind of looping there. So it's kind of scary.
Right.
I think from legal point of view, from kind of correctness point of view, from the bill point of view.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so for us, fortunately or unfortunately, these regulatory agency websites don't all have APIs. There are very few. There are some subcomponents of these websites that have APIs that we still tap into, and those are obviously easy to do. But a lot of, so say for the FDA, any review documents, basically the full set of documents that are published, which contain information about how the drug was analyzed, who was the reviewer, what was the back and forth between the company and the agency. Those are all actually not behind an API. They're literally on just web pages that you have to scrape, and we just respect their robots.txt. Then it's a 30-second delay that we have. Initially we didn't have it. Like initially when I designed it, there was really no delay at all. And once we got blocked is when we realized, okay, now we have to start respecting it. But yeah, that's how we do it. And so the reason I say fortunately as well is because otherwise we wouldn't exist as a company, I think, because if everything was behind APIs, then really it's very easy for anyone to start, tapping into those, and there would have been a centralized system, a few years ago. So it's really bad that, we had to do this, and we were the first to actually do this centralization across different agencies, just because no one chose to go through all this mess.
That's nice. And how do you know when something was updated? Do you have to scrape full site, or you load the site XML from the webmaster?
Yeah, so not all. So for certain sites, so for Health Canada, their site XML is regularly updated, so we are able to do that. For FDA, we are not able to, but we have, again, different strategies. For FDA, what they do is they publish approvals every day. Whatever new approvals came in for that day, they add it to one page, so that way we're able to go in. But they do other thing that's also sneaky, which is there are some approvals that happened before, they wouldn't publish it to that place, right? Like so basically a drug that was approved last year, and maybe they posted a correction or added a new document, they wouldn't actually post it to any specific web page. So we have to go back. So what we do is kind of a tiered approach. We continuously look for any new approvals that are there as of today. We run it on a loop, keep running on a loop. Every 3 days, if I'm not wrong, we do it for the month. So everything for that month, we rescrape and check if there's anything new. And then for the entire database, we do it every week. So every weekend, we still go through the entire database. Again, we don't have to, we just go through the scraping. If we already know, like Mike was pointing out about the idempotency rule, we check against an external data store and make sure that this event, we've already seen, so we're not going to process it again.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Come on, cannot be that shy. Any other questions? As for me, I really loved Mike's presentation too. It was totally fresh. There are a number of reInvent talks. There are a number of talks on this topic, and it was a completely nice, fresh angle for me. I was taking notes, and I like how it positioned it. It can be really applicable to any cloud. So you just use, in our case, for us. Like, that was beautiful.
And I think while I was talking, there was a question that actually came in my mind, and I don't know if I had the right answer to it, which was why we didn't use step functions, because Mike was telling us about this. So if I'm not wrong, for step functions, we had to have a well-defined set of steps. And if we have to change that, add more modules to it, it's not as simple. And Mike, is that right?
The way I would look at it is really like ownership, right? So you could say, like, in a startup like yours, where domain knowledge is shared and pretty complete for everybody, and like outcomes are sort of known. Yeah, you could orchestrate everything if you wanted to, right? Because it's within like the amount of information required to do that fits in one person's head. The challenge really is like the minute that you start dividing responsibilities between services to different developers, right? And that's where you get into the domain boundaries. So anytime, like, because domain boundaries can exist either like from the service like context perspective or like from like an ownership perspective, right? Like there's all kinds of ways that you can draw a box around things. So once you get more than one box, orchestration becomes a little rigid, becomes collaborative. You can't change anything without talking to everybody else, because you don't know like if what you're doing is going to impact their expectations of the system. And generally speaking, just like, I think if you can divide it down into smaller units of work that aren't interdependent, other than knowing what they each produce and consume, then that's the key differentiation, right? So you can absolutely accomplish both things. Like I think a fun thought exercise in most architecture discussions, if you go back to like debate class in high school, it's like, well, just give me the solution that I'm supposed to implement, and I'll tell you why it's the best one. So like you can have that conversation from any perspective, really. But if you're a really good architect or developer, you probably win, even if you're using a suboptimal like solution, big picture.
Right.
But I'd be thinking about it as like orchestration, really is meant in my mind for like very crisp, like slow changing, like anything that is easily described by like a graph, right? Like a DAG that one person owns. Whereas in a more complex environment where people are going to be doing things that you don't even know about, that's when the events become more important.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'd encourage you to do the form. I see only 8 people reply to it. You don't have to fully fill it. Just give your email so we can send you the Manning prize.
If you don't buy a ticket, you can't win the lottery.
It's free.
That's the appropriate price for a lottery, by the way. And anything more than free is only attractive to people who are bad at math. So
I see Mark in the meetup. It's been a while, Mark. I didn't see you.
Yeah, I've been, I've been recovering. No. No, the company I'm working for has been super busy, so I've been really pushing a lot of stuff. And Michael Dvorak and Rohit Joshi have been super helpful for us, Mike. So if you pass that on.
oh, nice.
So yeah, we've been working with them. My whole team, I've got them bothering them on a regular basis. So
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. They're both fantastic.
Okay, a couple more minutes for questions. If you guys too quiet, we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
I would just remind people, like, if you have a question that comes to you later, or you're too shy to ask your question here, just reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions offline. Just ping me on LinkedIn, or connect with Daniel and he can connect us together. So it doesn't have to. This isn't like a use it or lose it opportunity in that regard. But
maybe question regarding, like, again, step functions and some example. So the usual use case, for example, synchronous order creation, and during order creation there should be some multiple validations done before it succeeds. So if the company wants to migrate from synchronous order creation to asynchronous, so like user sends the payload, like, I want to create an order, we kind of return them the response, yeah, like, the order will be reviewed right now. And asynchronously, should this process asynchronous still be like within step function in order to be like orchestrated better, or it can be handled somehow using just asynchronous events?
So in that case, I think I would lean towards step functions, because you're getting into essentially what we call a distributed transaction, right? Like you need a union of success from all of those things to consider the overall operation of success. So you can get into the whole like saga pattern for how you unwind that process if one of those components fails. But yeah, that is going to be like very challenging to orchestrate or to choreograph, I guess, in any other way, because of the I'm looking for a word, I'm not getting it here, but anyway, because essentially you have a distributed transaction, right? So even from like potentially a sequencing perspective, it may not even just be you need all of them to say yes, like you need them to say yes in the right order. So that is a great use case for step functions, not so much just because it can do that that process for you, the distributed transaction process, but because it's also capable of unwinding it, right? So you can have the same like reverse logic applied once you detect failure at any point in the process as well. And then, yeah, as you point out, like you very correctly use the correct language with the customer. It's like, yes, we have received your order. We will update you as to its status in the future, right? Like that's a key sort of part on the business side of all of this, is that you're being like semantically correct in how you're communicating what's being done and when it's being done. So the customer has an expectation that like they don't need to sit here and wait, but you're going to get back to them if there's any problems or with the success criteria, right? They're going to either get a shipment notification or a, hey, we need more information from you type thing in a retail example.
Cool, thank you.
And startups question, like it's not often to see startups that succeed, and you did succeed. So you bootstrapped or you have investors. How did it work? Did you get first clients? How did you run into Techstars? Can you tell us about that journey, Krish?
Yeah,
from the idea to kind of first client, or Mike?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so basically the idea was, we started discussing the idea in 2018. So that's when Amin and I met. Amin is the CEO. So he's someone who's been in the industry for about 10 years, working on the biopharma side. He was working in business development roles. So when we met and discussed, he already had the idea of using technology to streamline the drug development process, and specifically the process, like not the discovery part, where there are a lot of AI companies doing the drug discovery side, but there are almost none using it properly on the development side. So yeah, that's when we started discussing, and I was still working at Samsung at the time. I quit in 2019. Then we started. Initially, we completely bootstrapped, just $10,000 from each of us. Got a grant from the government to help us to keep us going for the first year. Obviously, we took no salary, right, for the first year, and we talked to a lot of clients. Had just a lot of conversations where we were listening, and we had no idea that what we had to do was actually develop this platform, the one that I described. At that point, we had a lot of different ideas. Maybe doing optimization of clinical trial design as a pure thing, or just looking at connecting companies to the right contract research organizations to run the trials. So ideas like that we were exploring. So for the first year, I just built like 3 prototypes. We just showed them to the users, and they gave us feedback. And then eventually, by the end of the first year, it was clear that users wanted to be able to, these were specifically people in the regulatory intelligence side. So these are the people who are kind of like the librarians of the drug development teams who kind of manage all the information, and whoever has any question on, like, if a scientist has a question, they go to the regulatory intelligence people. If the CEO has a question, they go to the regulatory intelligence people. So these are the people who manage all this information. So they want answers to questions like, has this specific scenario happened in the past, and will the FDA approve it? Has it approved it before? Will it approve it now? Right. So those are the kind of questions they have. So that's what we set about, solving. So we got the first 2 clients, like that was 2021, March. We got the first one, and then by June we got the second one, and then we had applied to Techstars on the side. And yeah, we got through there. That gave us a little bit of funding, a lot of mentorship. Again, awesome people like Mike who are with us, and yeah, that got us to, by the end of that program, we raised a pre-seed round with a VC firm called Argonne Ventures out of Boston. So that was about $750K USD that we raised. So that was now December or January of 2022 actually is when we completed the raise. And yeah, after that we haven't raised. We're actually currently in that fundraising mode, but of course, given the economic climate, it's not been that easy. We're trying to overcome these challenges, but yeah, we added more clients, of course, last year as well, and we were still on track to adding 2 more clients in the next couple of months. Yeah, so that's the situation.
Awesome. And clients are from US or Canada?
They are mostly from the US. There's one from Canada. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I was just looking at your website. I like the fact that your landing splash page is actually you guys. Like, it looks like a stock photo at first, but it's actually you and Amin there standing there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
cool. Nice touch.
I'm glad you liked it.
How can this group help you succeed? What can we do to help you? To thank you.
Oh, sorry, you're asking me?
Yeah, like that.
Yeah,
you're still fighting to get the funding, and it's
Yes,
a
of
tough
course.
economy.
Yes.
So you have to sell more. Like, what do we need to tell people we know?
Yes. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. So yeah, I think in terms of asks, we just want to be connected to potential clients, of course. So anyone in any small biotechs, medium-sized biotechs, basically biotechs who are close to going to the FDA for their approval, those would be the right match for us at this point. So anyone from in that profile, you can put us in touch with them. Then of course investors, any people in the investor network. Yeah, again, people who are willing to do a seed round. So that's the kind of profile we're looking for. Again, people who are more on the biotech, biopharma side, they'd be more relevant to us.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll bookmark this part of the video.
Perfect.
Daniel, this is the second time that you're going to be asked to get your credit card out. Once from Mark, and now again.
That's cool. So guys, do the survey. We are kind of, or ask questions. Sherry, welcome back. Is your microphone working tonight?
I think it's time to give the people some free stuff.
Let's see if there are any more. Yeah, Sherry, you did the survey. So, are we ready for the wheel of names?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll share the screen again. Entire screen. This time I made sure I know where I'm going. Anybody here whose name is not did I miss anyone? I did Mike and Krish as well. And John and me, we don't normally participate.
I don't think I'm eligible for this award, but we'll see.
No, you're eligible. Everybody's eligible. Okay, so good luck. Let's do the spin. Oops. It's too dark here.
This isn't actually a website, wheelofnames.com.
Yeah.
Mihaly with us. If you're not here, like Mihaly with us. Yes, you are. Yeah, perfect. So send me your email address, paste it here, and then I'm going to introduce you to the good folks from Manning, and then you can claim any of the prizes you want. So that's for me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mike, for coming. Thank you, Krish, for sharing your story and architecture.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for joining. And as always, Daniel and John, thank you for your tireless efforts in hosting this community. I know it is not an easy, and it is very much a thankless process for most of the time. So thanks for that. And Krish, thanks for giving up your time to come talk to everybody. Really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure to be part of this. Yeah, hope to see you in future meetings.
Yeah, hope to see you back. Thanks a lot.
Have a great night.
Bye.